What do you need to know about Tokyo? Deep, deep waters. First time I came here, it was a transformative experience. It was powerful and violent experience. It was as if it was just like taking acid for the first time, meaning, what do I do now? I see the whole world in a different way. I often compare the experience of going to Japan for the first time, or going to Tokyo for the first time, to what Eric Clapton and Pete Townsend must have gone through, the reigning guitar gods of England, what they must have gone through the week that Jimi Hendrix came to town. You hear about it, you go see it, a window opens up into a whole new thing, and you think, what does this mean? What do I have left to say? What do I do now?
It is June the 25th, 1956, in New York City. Pierre, a classical music industry executive for Columbia Records, holds the hand of his wife Gladys, a copy editor at the New York Times, as she is wheeled into the maternity ward of the New York City Presbyterian Hospital. His grip releases as the foot of the gurney hits the swinging door of the entrance to the delivery room. Nervous glances are exchanged between husband and wife, and then all at once she is gone, leaving Pierre to his thoughts in a room of other men drinking bearable coffee from cheap styrofoam cups. Beyond that door, in the early summer, sun rays pouring in through the windows, Gladys is giving birth to their first child, Anthony. Born to a destiny unknown, this child would one day reshape the culinary world, weaving tales of flavour and wanderlust into the tapestry of writing and travel, leaving an indelible mark on both. Even as a boy, Anthony danced to the rhythm of rebellion. Comic books were his first escape, colourful pages brimming with the heroes, villains and daring exploits. He devoured stories of adventure, kindling a restless spirit that sought the thrill of the unknown. As he grew, the electrifying pulse of rock and roll became his anthem, the defiant chord striking a chord within his soul. His culinary awakening came on a family journey to France, a land where life and food intertwine seamlessly. One fateful day, aboard a weathered fisherman's boat, young Anthony tasted his first oyster. The briny burst of the sea on his tongue was more than a meal. It was a revelation. In that singular bite, the mundane cracked open to reveal a world of possibility. The seed was planted, one that would later grow into an obsession, a belief in food as a universal language, capable of forging connections across cultures and distances, a bridge between the familiar and the extraordinary. Anthony attended Vassar College in the mid-1970s, but dropped out after 2 years. He later enrolled at the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York. While honing his craft, he also immersed himself in the chaotic, gritty restaurant culture of the 1970s and 80s. This was a time when kitchens weren't just about food. They were hotbeds of vice, adrenaline, and camaraderie. Bourdain walked a razor's edge, a man unafraid to confront his demons as he descended into the underworld of addiction, by heroin's grip and cocaine's seductive pull. These weren't mere indulgences. They were a reckless quest for meaning, a search for something visceral and raw. Each high and low etched itself into his soul, leaving scars that would later bleed into his prose. In these dark alleys of life, Bourdain found not only chaos, but also clarity. The kitchen became his battleground and sanctuary, a space where the intensity of addiction was rivaled only by the heat of the stove. From these struggles emerged a voice, unvarnished by convention, a storyteller who could distill the bitter truth of human existence. The grit of his experiences gave his words an edge, cutting through the artifice to reveal something profoundly authentic. For Bourdain, the vices were not just struggles. They were the crucible that forged his unmistakable perspective on the world. Bourdain cut his teeth in the New York restaurant scene, starting as a dishwasher and eventually working his way up to chef. He worked in a variety of spots, including the iconic Manhattan restaurant Brasserie Leal, where he became executive chef. His years in the trenches of the culinary world were marked by long hours, camaraderie, and as he put it, the sheer madness of being alive in that moment. Bourdain was not a prodigy of a chef. He wasn't an household name or someone destined for culinary stardom. For years he worked as a journeyman in the unforgiving world of restaurant kitchens, in a world that didn't offer much glamour, just the chaos of fire, steel, and sweat. Leal, a bustling brasserie, became his home base. It was a place where he thrived in the madness, orchestrating the chaos as an executive chef, dishing out steak frites and other brasserie staples to the demanding crowds. The kitchen was his life, a place of hard labour, late nights and scars, both literal and emotional. For decades that was enough, but even in the grind of service, something stirred beneath the surface. Bourdain had stories from the trenches of restaurant life that few outside the world could imagine, tales of excess, misfits, and the relentless drive that defined the culinary underworld. He didn't start writing with a purpose. It was more like therapy. Scribbling after hours, he captured the gritty truth of restaurant life, the kind of raw honesty that no one was sharing at the time. And then, one day, he sent an essay to the New Yorker, almost on a whim. It was called "Don't Eat Before Reading This." A cheeky exposé of the unfiltered reality behind restaurant doors. It started as a rant, an exorcism really. The kitchen had been my temple and my battlefield, but I had carried its secrets in silence for too long. The camaraderie, the chaos, the brutal honesty of it all. I needed it to spill out. Late at night, after shifts that left me aching and covered in sweat, I'd sit with a cigarette and my thoughts. The words flowed like the steam off a fresh pot of stock, raw, hot, and unfiltered. The essay "Don't Eat Before Reading This" came first, a piece for the New Yorker that dashed off between shifts at Leal, not expecting much. I wrote it for cookbooks, for dishwashers, for the pirates of the kitchen. What I didn't expect was the reaction. The world was hungry for the truth, hungry for the stories of broken plates, egos, and rules, served with profanity and grease. From there, the idea grew, a full book, Kitchen Confidential. I dove headfirst, channeling years of frustration, humour, love for this strange life into every chapter. I wrote about the grind, the addictions, the mess, and the beauty. It wasn't just a cookbook, it was a manifesto, a love letter, and a confession all at once. When the book hit the shelves, I thought it might do well enough to buy me a few new knives, maybe pay some overdue bills. But then it hit the New York Times bestseller list. Suddenly, I wasn't just a line cook at Leal. I was a writer. People who never set foot in a professional kitchen devoured my stories, and they wanted more. They saw something in my words, a rawness, a truth they could taste. And just like that, my world shifted. I was no longer a voice in the back of a crowded kitchen. Invitations started pouring in. Book signings, interviews, events. My drug habit, once a way of coping with the grind, took a back seat. The adrenaline of recognition, of finally being heard, replaced the highs I once chased. For the first time in years, I pointed my focus on something other than survival. I had a story to tell. And the people, well, they just wanted to listen. The response was explosive. His words weren't just a laugh for fellow chefs. they resonated with a much larger audience. Suddenly, people outside the culinary bubble were intrigued by this unapologetic, profane, and darkly funny chef who seemed to pull back the curtain on an unseen world. Publishers came knocking, asking if there was more, and there was. His essay became the seed for Kitchen Confidential, a memoir that wasn't just a cookbook or a biography, but a raw, visceral account of what it truly meant to live the life of a chef. It was a part confession, part cautionary tale, and entirely unlike anything else anyone had ever read about food before. The book exploded almost overnight. There were interviews, articles, and TV producers calling, pitching ideas he'd never imagined. He wasn't a natural fit for fame. Anthony was a kitchen guy. Someone who spent decades hunched over cutting boards, working long shifts under fluorescent lights. But he was also a storyteller, someone with an insatiable curiosity and a knack for connecting people, whether over a plate of food or through the written word. Walking away from Les Halles wasn't easy. It meant leaving behind a world he had known for most of his adult life. But it also meant stepping into something bigger, something scarier, something that would define the rest of his days. He hadn't planned for it, but life rarely cares about plans. In the years to come, Bourdain would travel the world telling stories no one else could, and redefined what it meant to be a chef. But before all that, he was simply a man who worked the line, cooked the food, and decided one night to pick up a pen. A Cook's Tour was Anthony Bourdain's first foray into television, and it landed like a revolution. Airing in the early 2000s, it wasn't just another food show. It was raw, unscripted, a dive into the cultures and cuisines that shape our world. Audiences loved Bourdain's honesty, his irreverent humour, and his willingness to eat anything, sometimes to his regret. What it set apart was the heart behind it. Bourdain didn't just show you the food, he showed you the people, the grit, and the humanity of places often overlooked. Viewers were hooked, not because he was polished, but because he wasn't. He was flawed, curious, and unflinchingly real. The show was a hit, paving the way for a new kind of travel storytelling, one that wasn't afraid to dig into the messy chaos of life, one meal at a time. When Anthony Bourdain transferred from kitchens to television, it was like watching a chef step out of a sweltering back room and into the bright, unpredictable world beyond. His first show, A Cook's Tour, premiered in 2002 on the Food Network. It wasn't the polished, pre-packaged food television viewers were used to. Instead, it felt raw, adventurous, and above all, honest, just like Bourdain himself. The premise was simple. Bourdain would travel the globe in search of the perfect meal. But as anyone who followed his career would learn, his shows were never really about the food. They were about the people, the places, the cultures, and the stories behind every dish. One of his most memorable episodes was his visit to Vietnam. For Bourdain, Vietnam was more than just a destination. It was an obsession. As he rode through the streets of Ho Chi Minh City on the back of a motorbike, viewers could feel his excitement. He described the chaos of the city, the hum of scooters, and the intoxicating smell of street food, as though he had found a long-lost love. Sitting on a tiny plastic stool, slurping a bowl of pho, he looked entirely at home, like he'd found his place in the world. Another unforgettable moment came in Japan. In one episode, Bourdain immersed himself in the traditional and precise art of kaiseki dining. The meals were intricate, delicate, and nothing like the down and dirty fare of Les Halles. But what stood out wasn't just the food. It was how Bourdain, a self-described punk rock chef, adapted to this world of formality and restraint. It showed his capacity for respect, curiosity, and humility, even in unfamiliar territory. Then there was his journey to France, where he connected with his own heritage, eating roast pig and drinking wine. He reflected on his family and the way food ties people to their roots. These weren't just meals, they were moments of personal introspection, captured on camera and shared with the world. But a cook's tour wasn't all smooth sailing. It was a learning experience, not just for Bourdain but for the network as well. This was a man who didn't fit the mould of the Food Network host. He wasn't there to teach you the recipes or sell you cookware. He was there to tell stories. Messy, human, and sometimes uncomfortable stories. The show planted the seeds of what would later become a career not as a chef but as a traveller, a storyteller, a cultural explorer. A cook's tour wasn't just the beginning of Bourdain's TV journey, it was the moment when audiences saw what food television could be. Something authentic, something meaningful, something more. After a cook's tour, Anthony Bourdain's career skyrocketed. Shows like No Reservations and The Layover cemented his status as the voice of authentic travel storytelling. But it was Parts Unknown that elevated him to a cultural icon. It wasn't just a travel or food show, it was a series that fearlessly explored the intersections of food, politics and culture. He sat with locals in Beirut during bombings, ate noodles in Myanmar while discussing democracy, and unpacked the complexities of race and identity in America's Deep South. Each episode was a masterclass in empathy and storytelling, but behind the camera, the life of constant exploration began to take its toll. Bourdain spent upwards of 250 days a year on the road, an exhausting schedule that left little time for rest or stability. Physically, the demands were grueling. Endless flights, strange hours and heavy drinking during social meals that left him fatigued and worn down. The very lifestyle he celebrated, embracing spontaneity, eating late into the night, drinking with strangers, was unsustainable. Mentally, it was even harder. Bourdain was open about his struggles with depression, which had shadowed him for much of his life. The isolation of perpetual travel only deepened those struggles. While he was surrounded by people at every stop, the connections were often fleeting. He once described his life on the road as a series of hellos and goodbyes. And as glamorous as it appeared on screen, it was profoundly lonely behind the scenes. His relationships suffered. The strain of being away from loved ones, his daughter, his partners, his friends, left scars that never fully healed. He admitted to feeling guilt over missed moments and broken bonds, often using work as both a refuge and a distraction. The pressure to keep producing, to stay relevant, and to live up to the larger-than-life persona the world saw on TV became a heavy burden. Bourdain's candour about his mental health resonated with many, as he talked about his darker days, about the pull of addiction and the emptiness that fame could not fill. He didn't sugarcoat it, admitting that even his dream job couldn't silence his inner struggles. The very qualities that made him brilliant, his relentless curiosity, his raw honesty, his deep empathy, also made him vulnerable to the weight of the world he immersed himself in. In many ways, the road became a double-edged sword. It gave him purpose, meaning, and a platform to change the way people see the world. But it also drained him, mentally and physically, leaving him in a constant state of exhaustion and introspection. By the time Parts Unknown was airing its later seasons, Anthony Bourdain had become an icon, a cultural ambassador who broke barriers and redefined how stories about food and culture were told. But behind the captivating episodes and the effortless charm on screen, cracks had begun to show. The life that seemed so full, brimming with exotic adventures and connections with people across the globe, was also a lonely one. His personal life was equally tumultuous. His relationship with Italian actress Asia Argento was fiery and complicated. Both outspoken and deeply passionate, their union often drew media attention, and their private lives became increasingly public. Reports suggested that the relationship was strained towards the end, adding to the emotional weight Bourdain already carried. Whether or not this was a significant factor in his mental state remains unclear, but the pressures of fame, relationships and internal struggles compounded to a breaking point. On June the 8th, 2018, Bourdain was found dead in his hotel room in Kaiserberg, France. He was 61 years old. He had been in the region filming an episode of Parts Unknown with his close friend and fellow chef, Eric Ripert. His death, ruled a suicide by hanging, sent shockwaves around the world. The circumstances were haunting. There was no note, no public sign of distress leading up to the event. Friends and colleagues described him as seemingly normal in the days prior, cracking jokes and doing what he loved most, connecting with people. Yet the closest to him knew he had struggled in private for years. His death left questions that would never fully be answered. Bourdain's passing wasn't just the loss of a beloved public figure, it was a stark reminder of how mental illness can persist in even the most extraordinary lives. It forced a global reckoning with the reality that success, fame, and external validation can't shield someone from the inner battles they fight every day. The reactions to Bourdain's death were overwhelming. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Fans, colleagues, and strangers alike mourned a man who had inspired them to see the world differently, to embrace its diversity, and to take chances on the unfamiliar. The reaction to Bourdain's death was overwhelming. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Fans, colleagues, and strangers alike mourned the man who had inspired them to see the world differently, to embrace its diversity, and to take chances on the unfamiliar. Fellow chefs like Gordon Ramsay and Jose Andres, travel writers and cultural figures shared heartfelt messages, remembering Bourdain as a trailblazer who championed the stories of people often overlooked. The loss hit hardest among those who saw themselves in him, the chefs, writers, travellers and creatives who struggled with the pressures of their industries. Bourdain's death ignited conversations about mental health in high-stress careers and the importance of addressing depression openly. His passing also shed light on the hidden toll of constant travel and the isolation that can come from living in a public life. For many, the grief was compounded by a sense of helplessness. How could someone so loved, so seemingly engaged in the world, take his own life? His story became a call to action, urging people to check in on their loved ones and to acknowledge that even those who seem to have it all can be silently suffering. In the years since his death, Anthony Bourdain's legacy has only grown. His work, his books, his TV shows, his interviews continue to inspire. He didn't just teach us about food, he taught us about humanity. He showed that a meal was never just a meal. It was a window into culture, history, and shared experiences that unite us all. Bourdain's approach to storytelling remains unparalleled. He had a rare ability to blend humour with depth, irreverence and reverence. Whether he was sharing a bowl of noodles in Hanoi with President Obama, or sitting in silence with a family in war-torn Beirut, he brought dignity to every story he told. He made the unfamiliar familiar and the distance seem close. Perhaps Bourdain's greatest gift was his ability to make the world feel smaller. He encouraged us to be curious, to step out of our comfort zones, and to embrace the messy, beautiful chaos of life. His voice, his perspective, and his humanity are sorely missed, but his message lives on. In the end, Bourdain's life was both extraordinary and deeply human. He lived with a relentless hunger for adventure, for understanding, for connection, and while that hunger may have been his greatest gift to the world, it was also perhaps what made his struggles so profound. His was a story of brilliance and vulnerability. A reminder that the most important journeys we take are not just across borders, but within ourselves.